Welcome, Algebra 1. This is section 3.2 and 3.3, solving inequalities with operators plus, minus, multiply, and divide. The essential question is, what is the difference between solving inequalities and equations? Let's begin. So the goal with solving inequalities is the same thing as we did last week. It's to isolate the variable. Say that out loud, please. Isolate the variable. Yell it. I can't hear you. Okay, that was pretty good. So when we isolate the variable, I might have an equation 3x minus 5 is greater than 10, and then you isolate it and do some magic, and you get x is greater than 5. Now that x is isolated. It's the same thing as before, except I have a different sign here, not an equal sign. I have an inequality. Always ask yourself when you're trying to isolate the variable, does this help me isolate the variable? If it doesn't make it easier, you don't have to do that step. You probably shouldn't. So let's begin. Isolating the variable in inequalities is almost the same. So a lot of cases it is the same. There's just one little difference, and we'll show you later. So in this case, x plus 2 is greater than 5. To isolate the variable here, I will subtract 2 on both sides. So when you subtract 2 on both sides, those 2's will cancel, because positive 2 to negative 2 is 0. So you get x is greater than 3. And on the other side, x plus 3 is less than or equal to 1. Well, x minus 3, I have to do an x plus, I have to add 3 to both sides. Plus 3 and plus 3. The 3's will cancel. I'll get x is less than or equal to positive 2. And you know what? I can graph those as well. So I'll graph this really quick of 3. So if I put this at 0, and that's going to be 1, 2, and 3. X is greater than 3 would be graphed at 3 in open circle, and greater than goes to the right. Graphing that 1 on the right-hand side, I'm going to graph 0, 1, and 2. At less than or equal to, the or equal to means I have to do a filled in circle, and less than means you go to the left. So it'll be just like that. Alright, let's try two others. So these work out the same way as well. 4x is greater than 12. I got to isolate the x. 4 times x means divide by 4 on both sides. The 4's cancel out. I get x is greater than 3, and I can graph that. 0, 1, 2, 3. I do an open circle, and greater than goes to the right. And the other one, x divided by 5 is greater than or equal to 10. I will have to multiply by 5 on both sides. So if you multiply by 5, those cancel. I'm going to get x is greater than or equal to 50. And if I wanted to graph that, I do 50 marks. No, I don't. I'm just going to shorthand that and say this is 50 out here. And I will do an open circle. And greater than that should go in the greater than direction. If you get something like this and you have to graph it, don't do 50 marks. You can go up by 10 every time. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. That's a lot more reasonable than 50 marks. Alright, next one. So here's where it's actually different. There's one huge difference, and you got to do this. When you multiply or divide by a negative, flip the inequality sign. So that means if you have an inequality like this, you flip it to this. So less than flips to greater than. So if you have something like this, you flip it to this. We just flip it around. So if it's less than, it goes to greater than. If it's greater than, it goes to less than. You always leave the equal part if the equal part is there. So for example, and look at these very carefully, negative 3 times x is less than 15. I will divide by negative 3 on both sides. When you divide by negative 3, the negative 3's cancel out. So I'm left with x, and 15 divided by negative 3 is negative 5. But since I divided by a negative 3, I must flip this sign. So this sign must flip to greater than. So now I have x is greater than negative 5. On the one on the right, negative x divided by 4 is greater than or equal to positive 5. Well, I want to get rid of this negative 4 divided by negative, so I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 4. Multiply both sides by negative 4. This cancels out those negative signs, and it also cancels out the 4, so I'm left with x on this side, and on the right, 5 times negative 4 is negative 20, but you must take this sign and flip it. So it goes x is less than or equal to negative 20. So that's the huge difference there. So many people forget that. It's the only thing different. So if you can solve equalities, you can solve inequalities. Just remember, when you multiply or divide by negatives, you have to do something different. Just a little notes about that. Just because there's negatives in the inequality doesn't mean you always flip it. So if you multiply or divide by a positive, don't flip the sign. I know this says 2x is less than negative 4, but just because that's negative doesn't mean we flip. because all I do is divide by 2 on both sides. And so I'm going to get x is less than negative 2. I don't flip the sign just because the right is negative. It's only if I divide or multiply by a negative. Same thing over here. If I subtract a variable, it doesn't mean I flip the sign. Just because I'm subtracting 3x to both sides doesn't mean I flip the sign. These 3x's cancel. I'm left with 5 is greater than 2x. And then you can divide by 2, and you get x is less than or equal to 5/2. So just because I subtract doesn't mean I always flip. So there's a minus sign there, but I'm subtracting. So those are the differences. We only do it when we multiply or divide by a negative. Let's try some examples. So pause the video. Okay, let's solve these and graph them. So p minus 4 is less than 1. I have a minus 4 next to the p, so I have to do the opposite of that, which is add 4 to both sides. When you add 4, those will cancel out. I get p is less than 5. And if I wanted to graph that, I'm going to draw my perfectly straight line. And then I'm going to start with 0, and I'm going to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And since p is less than 5, less than means I have an open circle at 5, and less than goes in the left direction. So there's my graph of this inequality. The bottom one, so I have 8 is greater than or equal to d minus 2. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides, because I got to isolate the d, and you cancel out the 2's, so I get 8 plus 2, 10 is greater than or equal to d. Now, if I want to graph this, and be careful when you graph this, because you notice how the d's on the right-hand side, usually it's on the left. A lot of you have this habit of, oh, since the arrow is kind of pointing to the left, to the right direction, I will graph it to the right. But that's not correct. Watch what happens. I'm going to go up by 2 every time. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I can choose whatever scale I want. So it's greater than, it's or equal to, so I know I have a closed circle at 10. Now, again, you might see this and you say, oh, because it's an arrowhead, so it'll go to the right. But that's not correct. Because the d's on this side, 10 is greater than or equal to d. So another way to make this work out, you want to put the variables on the left side. So let's flip this whole equation. D, but if you flip the d and the 10, you must also flip that inequality. So it's going to be d is less than or equal to 10. So it's actually, the arrow is going to the left, less than. So always, maybe the best thing to do is actually read this out loud yourself. 10 is greater than or equal to d. Well, if 10 is greater than d, that means d has to be a number that's less than 10. So, follow that trick, but just be careful. I think you should be able to, you should read those out to yourself, and hopefully that'll help you understand this a lot better. Let's try another one. Pause the video. All right, let's try a solve and graph. So negative x divided by 3 is less than negative 1. So I want to get rid of this negative 3, so I multiply by negative 3 on both sides. And multiplying by negative 3 cancels out those, so I'm left with x is less than negative 1 times negative 3. Oops, I made a mistake. I multiplied by a negative. So negative 1 times negative 3 is positive 3. But since I multiplied by a negative, I must flip the sign. So x is greater than 3. Ooh, see, even I make those mistakes. So let's graph that. I'm going to put 0 here and count up 1, 2, 3. And it's an open circle. Since it's open, it's greater than open, and x is greater than 3 should be in that direction. Now the next one. So divide by negative 3 on both sides. Since we're dividing by a negative 3, it's going to be flipping the signs. X is less than or equal to 9 divided by negative 3 is negative 3. So let's graph that. And I'll put a 0 right here in the middle, and I go down, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3 is right here. I'm going to do a closed circle since it's or equals to, a closed circle right there, and x is less than that, so less than goes in the negative direction. That's my graph, and that's it.